Star Trek's original Borg plan was so much worse than the iconic villains we got. The Borg have become one of Star Trek's most well-known and terrifying villains, but the cybernetic drones could have been very different. Introduced in Star Trek The Next Generation Season 2, Episode 16, Q-Who, the Borg became an immediate dire threat to the crew of the USS Enterprise D. When Q, John DeLanke, flung the Starship Enterprise across the galaxy into Borg space, Captain Jean-Luc Picard, Patrick Stewart, attempted to reason with the drones that attacked his ship. Not only did the Borg completely ignore Picard, but they also proved incredibly adaptable, thwarting every attack the Enterprise threw at them. The Borg would go on to appear in over 50 episodes of Star Trek and serve as the primary antagonists in one of the franchise's most successful films, Star Trek: First Contact. Captain Picard faced the Borg on numerous occasions, as did Star Trek Voyager's Captain Catherine Janeway, Kate Mulgrew, when she encountered them in the unexplored Delta Quadrant. The Borg consisted of a massive collective of drones all operating with one hive mind, overseen by the Borg Queen, Alice Krige. This sounds reminiscent of a beehive, which makes sense considering the Borg were originally conceived as a race of insectoids. Star Trek's plan for Insect Borg would have made the villains much less chilling initially. Star Trek The Next Generation's producers imagined the Borg as insectoids, but this proved too costly for production. The end result of humanoid drones kept some elements of the insect mentality, ultimately making the Borg more frightening. The Borg assimilate everything and everyone in their path, repeating resistance is futile when anyone tries to stop them. They cannot be reasoned with, and even if someone does manage to kill one, it will quickly be replaced by another. While all of this would have been scary in insect form, it removes the most terrifying aspect of the Borg. The Borg are scary because they strip away everything that makes people who they are, turning them into mindless drones with no control over their own actions. Later Star Trek Borg episodes prove that assimilated Borg drones could be rehabilitated, which makes them even more frightening in a way. Even after being assimilated, the victim remains alive, their mind trapped somewhere inside them. The Borg are a dark reflection of humanity, relentlessly consuming everything they can with no regard for the feelings of others. This element of the Borg would have been lost if they had simply been creepy metal bugs. Star Trek The Next Generation's best story couldn't have happened with Insect Borg. While Insectoid Borg may have still assimilated humans in some way, they presumably would not have turned them into Borg drones. This means one of Star Trek The Next Generation's best stories, the best of both worlds, could never have happened. In its third season, TNG finally began to hit its stride, producing some truly iconic and classic episodes. TNG Season 3 ended with a bang, as Captain Picard was captured and assimilated by the Borg. With Commander William Riker, Jonathan Frakes, in command of the USS Enterprise D, Picard became the mouthpiece of the Borg, Locutus. Picard's experience as Locutus had a profound effect on him and continues to influence Star Trek stories even today. Not only did Star Trek First Contact revisit Picard's assimilation, but Star Trek Picard also forced Jean-Luc to confront his time as Locutus. While fans will never know what kinds of stories Insectoid Borg would have produced, several of Star Trek's most memorable stories and characters would have been drastically different. Even 34 years later, Star Trek The Next Generation's The Best of Both Worlds remains one of the franchise's finest stories, and it might not have happened if the Borg had been bugs. In the Star Trek universe, few adversaries have been as iconic or as fearsome as the Borg. The hive mind species, obsessed with perfection and assimilation, have long stood as a terrifying reflection of humanity's fear of losing individuality in a technological age. Introduced in Star Trek The Next Generation (TNG), the Borg have become one of the franchise's most well-known and enduring antagonists. Their relentless pursuit of assimilating entire civilizations and their eerie mantra, "resistance is futile," cemented them as an enemy unlike any the Federation had faced before. However, what many fans may not know is that the original concept for the Borg was drastically different and arguably much worse than the cybernetic menace we ultimately saw. Initially, the Borg were not even intended to be the part machine, part organic beings we now recognize. Early drafts of the TNG episode Q-Who, where the Borg first appear, envisioned them as a species of insect-like creatures. According to early production notes and ideas floated by series creators, the Borg were supposed to resemble a swarm of locusts, overtaking planets and consuming all resources. This would have made them more akin to a biological plague than the terrifyingly efficient cybernetic organism we came to know. But there were several reasons why this original plan was both creatively less compelling and logistically problematic. The first issue with the insectoid version of the Borg was that it risked being a cliched enemy. Science fiction is filled with insect-like alien species, from Starship Troopers arachnids to Ender's Game formics, so another bug-based threat wouldn't have stood out. Insect species tend to represent primal, swarm-like threats, mindless, unstoppable forces. This is a familiar trope in science fiction, where aliens are often reduced to caricatures of inhumanity, their otherness represented through animalistic or swarm behavior. While effective in creating a sense of threat, this version of the Borg would have lacked the philosophical depth that ultimately made them so unique and enduring. The second issue was practicality. Portraying a convincing race of insectoid aliens in the late 1980s would have required a level of special effects and prosthetics that would have been difficult, if not impossible, on Star Trek's television budget. While Star Trek had always pushed the boundaries of what could be achieved on TV with its makeup and effects, insectoid creatures would likely have come off as campy or underwhelming, undermining their threat level. In contrast, the Borg as cybernetic beings allowed for a much simpler, yet far more menacing visual presentation. Their black, armor-like suits and pale, expressionless faces were both eerie and effective, all while remaining relatively cost-effective to produce. However, the greatest flaw in the original Borg concept was thematic. The insectoid Borg lacked the deeper existential terror that the cyborg Borg would embody. The eventual version of the Borg struck at a much more profound fear, the loss of individuality and autonomy in the face of technological domination. The Borg's method of assimilation, transforming individuals into part of a collective, stripping them of their humanity and free will, was a metaphor that resonated deeply, especially in a time when concerns about the dehumanizing effects of technology and the increasing power of artificial intelligence were on the rise. They represented a direct contrast to the Federation's ideals of freedom, individuality, and diversity. The Borg were a nightmarish reflection of what humanity might become if it allowed technology to overtake its soul. By turning the Borg into cyborgs rather than insects, the writers tapped into a different set of anxieties, ones that were far more relevant to the series' broader themes. The Borg weren't just a physical threat, they were an ideological one. Their hive mind was the antithesis of everything the Federation stood for. Their offer, join us and achieve perfection, but at the cost of your identity, was both seductive and horrifying. This added a layer of psychological horror that the insectoid Borg never would have been able to achieve. Furthermore, by making the Borg part machine, Star Trek opened the door to questions about the nature of life, technology, and consciousness that the series would continue to explore. Characters like Data, the android struggling to understand humanity, and episodes dealing with the ethical implications of artificial intelligence gained new dimensions when juxtaposed against the Borg. If Data represented technology striving for individuality and humanity, the Borg represented the opposite, technology that consumed and obliterated those qualities. This thematic richness would have been lost with a simpler insectoid enemy.